All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring a seriously fascinating constitutional debate. Should an executive leader actually have a time limit on their rule? Now, for most of us living in modern democracies, this feels like a totally settled question, right? We're so used to the rhythm of election cycles, the peaceful transfer of power, and those strict constitutional guardrails that say, hey, your time is up. But what if we step outside that familiar framework? The source material we're digging into today presents this incredibly intricate look at the classical Islamic governance model, the Caliphate. And in this system, the rules of power and time operate on a completely different philosophical axis. Let's take a look at how that actually works. Because this is the core tension we're looking at today. It challenges all our modern assumptions about power, accountability, and the passage of time. When we hear the phrase leader for life, our minds instantly jump to tyranny, corruption, absolute dictatorships. We kind of assume that without the ticking clock of a term limit, human nature is just going to corrupt the leader. But the source material asks us to pause for a second. It asks us to examine whether that correlation is an absolute truth, or if it's kind of just a byproduct of the specific political systems we happen to live in. It's really about how the concept of time itself shapes how a government plans for the future.
Part 1. The term limit debate. Ancient norms versus modern republics.
To really understand this, we first need to look at how different systems view the very concept of a leader's term, and this is a brilliant contrast. In a modern Western republic, take the US after the 22nd Amendment in 1951, for example, the presidency is strictly capped at 2 terms. Why? Specifically to prevent a monarch-like figure from taking over. But the classical Islamic model? Well, the position of the Caliph is theoretically intended to be a lifelong appointment. This divergence isn't just some historical accident. It's rooted in completely different legal and philosophical approaches to governance. Moving on to part 2, the Bay'a contract, the legal precedent. So what's the actual legal justification for a lifelong ruler in this Islamic framework? It all comes down to something called the Bay'a. Now, this translates to a pledge of allegiance, but legally speaking, it operates as a binding, ruling contract between the citizens and the head of state. Now, some modern academics look at this and say, well, because the Bay'a is a contract, and many Islamic contracts, like a debt contract, have an explicit end date, maybe the Bay'a could hypothetically have a time limit attached to it. It's seen as a modern way to prevent corruption. But as the source text thoroughly documents, classical scholars view the nature of this specific contract very differently. Historically, there's a really strong consensus among the companions of the Prophet that this contract is mutlaq, which means it is completely unrestricted by time. That sets a really firm legal precedent. The source notes that the Bay'a is actually more akin to a marriage contract in Islamic law, which is also unrestricted by a time limit. And we see this in practice with the rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Amr, and Uthman. None of them were given a pledge with a strict 4-year or 8-year cap. Actually, historical texts even cite a moment where Uthman was specifically advised not to cast off the garment of leadership. It really underscores the gravity and permanence expected of the role. The consensus was pretty clear. You serve until death or lawful removal, not just until an arbitrary timer runs out.
Which brings us to part 3, short-term versus long-term, the philosophy of time in governance.
Now let's talk about the philosophy of time for a second, because this debate over lifelong rulers isn't uniquely Islamic. It was heavily debated in the West too. The implications of how long a leader stays in power fundamentally change how that leader thinks. French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville actually warned that re-election campaigns breed short-term thinking. When observing early American democracy, he pointed out a massive vulnerability. When a leader's survival depends on the very next election, their entire administration bends toward that one single goal. The long-term needs of the country, those are quietly swapped out for the immediate, short-term individual interest of a politician who just wants to secure votes.
And get this, it's actually kind of wild, but the American founders grappled with this exact same thing. Alexander Hamilton literally argued for a lifelong executive during the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Hamilton believed a permanent executive would insulate the leader from foreign corruption and provide some serious national stability. He argued that an executive is actually less dangerous to the public when in office for life, compared to some chaotic short-term scramble for power. Obviously, the U.S. eventually settled on unlimited re-elections and later capped it with the 22nd Amendment, but that early debate shows that the strategic advantages of a lifelong leader were taken very, very seriously in Western political thought. To see how this long-term vision works in practice, let's look at the Umayyad era. See, a lifelong leader has the political capital to execute necessary strategic plans that might be incredibly unpopular in the moment.
For instance, Caliph al-Walid ordered a massive expansion of the Prophet's mosque to 123 by 123 meters. But doing this meant tearing down the original historic houses of the Prophet's family that surrounded the area. Naturally, the public was absolutely against destroying these historic homes. They wanted them preserved, so future pilgrims could contemplate the humble origins of the state. But the Caliph pressed on anyway. He prioritized the long-term necessity of facilitating prayer for future generations over his own short-term popularity. Think about it. If he were facing re-election the following year, this deeply unpopular yet structurally necessary project likely never would have seen the light of day.
Part 4. Elections and Ideology. Do term limits actually prevent tyranny?
This brings us to a really critical evaluation. Do frequent elections actually guarantee good governance? We usually equate the mechanics of voting with the absolute prevention of tyranny, right? But the source points out that in non-ideological societies, regular elections often don't stop tyranny at all. Just look at the staggeringly high, non-competitive results in places like Egypt and Syria. In 2018, the Egyptian election yielded a 97% result for the incumbent. The argument here is that without a unifying ideology binding the rulers and institutions to a shared constitutional truth, the mere act of casting a ballot just becomes a sort of superficial theater, masking authoritarianism. On top of that, constant election cycles can allow corporate interests to completely hijack government agendas through massive campaign spending. To put that into perspective, just think about the 2020 U.S. presidential election. It cost an estimated $14 billion. Billion. When leaders are constantly trapped in a cycle of needing billions of dollars just to retain their seat, they're inevitably bound to the special interests funding them. The source argues that a lifelong term structurally removes this financial dependency, insulating the executive from this specific brand of corporate capture.
Part 5. Impeaching a Caliph, the accountability resolution.
Okay, so here is the million-dollar question. What happens if a lifelong leader goes bad? Because history tells us for sure that unchecked power is a recipe for disaster. If elections aren't the mechanism for removal, how does the system prevent a caliph from becoming a dictator? If you grant someone executive power for life, and they start acting oppressively or violating the law, you obviously can't just wait around for them to die. There has to be a robust constitutional off-ramp.
The crucial thing to remember here is that a caliph is not an absolute monarch. He cannot legislate laws from his own mind, because all laws are derived directly from the Sharia. This is a massive distinction. The source quotes Orientalist historians who noted that while the caliph holds immense executive power, he is entirely destitute of legislative power, meaning he can't just invent a law to benefit his family or tax his enemies out of existence. He is bound by divine law, and the interpretation of that law is managed by scholars, not the executive branch. This strict separation of powers fundamentally limits the scope of what he can actually do. And for accountability, the system relies on an independent judiciary known as the Mahkamat al-Mazalim, or the Court of Unjust Acts. Now, this isn't just some advisory board. It's the highest judicial authority in the state. While local assemblies can remove governors and mayors through a vote of no confidence, the removal of the head of state himself is strictly a judicial matter. And here's the kicker. The caliph has absolutely zero power to remove or dismiss a judge from this specific court who happens to be investigating him.
So if the leader breaches his constitutional contract, this court follows a very strict step-by-step judicial process to legally impeach and remove him. Remember that Bea contract from earlier? It comes with strict conditions, like the implementation of justice. If the caliph violates those core pillars, the contract becomes legally defective. The Court of Unjust Acts investigates, and if they rule that the contract is void, boom, the caliph is instantly impeached. It's an entirely legal, non-electoral mechanism designed specifically to stop a tyrant without tearing the whole state apart through a bloody revolution. And we actually see this play out in history. For example, the Ottoman judiciary successfully utilized this exact mechanism to remove Sultan Selim III. The Sheikh al-Islam, acting as the supreme judicial authority of this court, evaluated the actions of the head of state, found them in breach of the governing contract, and legally issued the order for his removal. It proves that this framework isn't just theoretical. There's real historical precedent for the judicial branch overpowering a lifelong executive when the law demands it. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to ponder. Is our modern system of term limits really the definitive answer, or is it just one way to solve the eternal challenge of power? We've looked closely at how a lifelong executive is designed to govern with an eye on the distant future, insulated from the expensive chaos of constant elections, yet firmly tethered to a strict legal code and an independent Supreme Court. It challenges us to realize that accountability can take many forms, and that the way we manage time and power today is really just one chapter in a much longer, fascinating story of human governance. Thank you so much for exploring this with me.